Welcome to Hashi Rest, a quiet place for those drawn to inexplicable mysteries and slow stories. Tonight's story is one I wrote myself, with a little help along the way. A quiet piece of fiction made to help you relax and carry you gently into sleep. So get comfortable. We're about to begin. And if this kind of a story is what you've been looking for, a like or a comment will mean the world to me. It's the simplest way to help more people find they were healed. I'm looking at 3 pieces of something on my desk right now. Small things, worn and moved by salt and water. They don't look like much on their own, but together, and I only realized this recently, they're part of something larger, something the ocean has been leaving for me, piece by piece, over the course of an entire summer. I still don't have an explanation for how they got there. But to understand what they mean, you have to understand how it all began. And that takes us back to a morning in early June, before I noticed anything unusual at all. The stretch of beach I walk most evenings is about half a mile long. It begins where the parking lot ends in a narrow wooden path cut through the tall grass, and it finishes at a cluster of dark rocks that appear at low tide and disappear again before morning. Most people don't walk that far. They stop near the water edge, take a photograph or two, and turn back before the light changes. I used to do the same thing. That was before I started paying attention to what the ocean leaves behind. I didn't plan to move to Oregon. That's the part people find hardest to believe when I tell the story. I had been living in a city on the East Coast for most of my 20s. A good life by most measures. A small apartment I had slowly made my own. Work that kept me busy enough not to think too hard about whether busy was the same as satisfied. Friends I met for dinner on weekends and texted during the week. The ordinary architecture of a life that looked, from the outside, exactly as it was supposed to. I was 26 when I took the road trip. No particular reason, just a long weekend that became a week, and a week that stretched almost without my permission into 3. I drove west without a fixed route, stopping when something caught my attention, moving on when it didn't. I had reached Northern California before I realized I was closer to Oregon than I had ever been. So I kept driving. I arrived on the coast on a Thursday afternoon in late September. The sky was low and gray in a particular way the Pacific Northwest does better than anywhere else. Heavy with something that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to rain. I stopped at a lookout point because there was a parking space and I had been driving for 4 hours and my coffee had gone cold somewhere around the California border. I go out of the car intending to stretch my legs for 5 minutes. I stayed for 2 hours. The scene from that cliff was unlike anything I had seen before. Not prettier, exactly, than the other oceans I had known. Just different in a way I couldn't immediately name. Bigger somehow, though I knew that made no logical sense. The waves below were long and slow, arriving from very far away, breaking against the dark rocks with a sound that seemed to travel up through the ground rather than through the air. The wind moved constantly, not cold enough to be unpleasant, just enough to remind you it was there. And the light, even beneath the gray sky, the light on the Oregon coast had a quality I had never encountered. Softer than I expected, more patient, as though it wasn't in a hurry to become anything other than what it was already was. I stood at that lookout for 2 hours and thought about almost nothing, which I realized on the drive back to my motel that evening was something that hadn't happened in longer than I could remember. I went back to the East Coast after the trip. Of course I did. I had a life there, an apartment, a job, the ordinary architecture, but something had shifted in a way I couldn't undo. Not dramatically, just quietly and completely. The way a door once opened changed the feeling of a room even when you close it again. I thought about the lookout point more than I expected. The sound of the waves traveling through the ground, the patient light, the 2 hours of almost nothing. By January, I had given notice on my apartment. By March, I had packed what fit into my car and donated the rest. And by the time the Oregon coast was emerging from its winter fog into the long, slow light of early summer, I was already there. Already walking the path through the dune grass. Already learning the sound the wooden boards made underfoot. Already beginning, without knowing it yet, to pay attention to what the ocean leaves behind. The town I settled in was small enough that I knew the names of the people at the coffee shop, but large enough that I could disappear for an entire afternoon without anyone noticing. The beach became my way of relaxing. At first, I walked simply to feel the sand shift beneath my shoes, to watch the light change over the water, to let the sound of the waves replace whatever was running through my mind. The Oregon coast at sunset is not the kind of a beach that appeared on postcards. The water is cold even in summer. The sand is dark in places, almost grey, and the wind moves through constantly, carrying salt and the faint smell of kelp and something older underneath. The horizon stretches endlessly to the west. Some evenings, when the clouds are low and the light catches the water at the right angle, the whole surface of the ocean turns the color of copper. Those were the evenings I began staying longer than I intended. The beach combing started by accident. I had never been the kind of person who collected things. I preferred empty surfaces, clear window sills, shelves with room to breathe. But there was something about walking with my eyes down, scanning the tide line, that felt different from collecting. It felt more like listening. The ocean deposits things in a specific way, not randomly, though it can look that way at first. After enough evenings, you begin to notice patterns. The lightest objects gather in loose clusters near the dry sand. Heavier things travel further down, closer to the water. Glass arrives smoothed and clouded, its edges worn soft after months of years of movement. Shells come in fragments mostly, though occasionally a whole one appears. So perfect seems impossible that it's so ripe. Wood arrive dark and heavy, waterlogged, smelling of deep water and distance. I learned to read the tide line the way you learned to read a room. Quietly, without rushing, letting your eyes settle rather than search. Most evenings I found ordinary things. A piece of sea glass, pale green, small enough to rest in the center of my palm. A fragment of crab shell, orange and white, still faintly iridescent in the fading light. Rope sometimes, in short twisted length, bleached almost colorless. Occasionally a fishing float, round and hollow, that made a soft sound when I turned in it my hands. I never kept most of what I found. I would examine something for a moment, feel its weight, run my thumb along its texture, and then set it back down at the edge of the water. It felt right to return things, as though I were only borrowing them briefly from whatever journey they were still on. The few things I kept were always small. A piece of blue glass so dark it was almost black. A smooth stone with a single white line running through its center like a brushstroke. A small spiral shell, no larger than my thumbnail, that still smelled faintly of the sea weeks after I brought it home. I kept them in a shadow dish on my windowsill, where the evening light reached them for an hour before moving on. The walk itself had become something I looked forward to in the way you look forward to a cup of tea at the end of a long day. Not dramatic, not exciting, just quietly necessary. I would leave my apartment around 5 in the afternoon, when the light was already beginning to soften and the beach has emptied of most of the day's visitors. The wooden path through the tall grass made a specific sound underfoot, a low, hollow rhythm. I knew exactly where it creaked and where it felt firm. At the end of the path, the sound opened and the sound of the ocean arrived all at once. That moment never got old. No matter how many times I made that walk, the transition from the sheltered path to the open beach always felt like stepping into something larger than myself. I would stand for a moment at the edge of the tall grass, let my eyes adjusting to the space, let the wind find me. Then I would turn south toward the rocks and begin. It was a Tuesday in early June when I found the first piece. The tide had been low all afternoon, and the beach was wider than usual, exposing a long dark strip of wet sand that caught the evening light like a mirror. I was walking slowly, as I always did, my eyes moving along the tide line without any particular intention. The wind was mild for Oregon, warm enough that I had rolled up my sleeves for the first time since spring. Somewhere behind the low clouds, the sun was beginning its descent, turning everything faintly amber. I almost missed it. It was half buried in a tangle of dark kelp, close to the waterline, and its color was so similar to the wet sand around it that my eyes moved past it twice before something made me stop. I reached down and pulled it free from the kelp. It was heavier than I expected, small enough to fit comfortably in one hand. Dark wood, almost mahogany in color, though the water had deepened its tone until it was difficult to say for certain. One side was smooth, worn by years of movement. The other had a border carved along its edge, simple and fine, the kind of detail that takes patience and care to make. At its center, barely visible beneath a thin layer of salt, was an inlet pattern. I brushed it gently with my thumb. A small crescent moon fell against the dark wood, surrounded by 5 small stars, each no larger than a pinprick. I stood there for a long moment, turning it in my hands. The ocean continued behind me, The wind moved through quietly, and something happened that I have tried many times to describe accurately since then, and have never quite managed. It was not a memory. Nothing specific surfaced. No image, no name, no particular moment from my past. It was more like the feeling a memory leaves behind after the details have gone. A warmth somewhere behind the chest. A sense of something almost recognized. Like hearing the first few notes of a song you haven't heard in years and knowing, before it continues, that you already know every word. I didn't understand it. I still don't entirely. I only know that I stood at the edge of the water for longer than I realized, holding a small piece of dark wood with a moon carved into it, while the light changed slowly around me and the tide began to creep back in. And when I finally turned to walk home, I didn't put it back. For the first time in 2 years of walking to the beach, I put something in my pocket and carried it with me. I told myself it was just a pretty thing, an interesting find, something to set on the windowsill beside the glass and the stones. But even then, before I knew what it was or where it had come from, some quieter part of me suspected it was something else entirely. The piece of wood sat on my windowsill for 3 days before I did anything about it. I moved it once to the dust sill and then placed it back in exactly the same spot, facing the same direction, without really thinking about why. During those 3 days, I found myself looking at it at odd moments. In the morning, when the light came through the window at a low angle and caught the carved edge of the moon. In the evening, when the last of sun turned the dark wood almost red, I told myself I was simply appreciating it the way you appreciate any beautiful object, a thing found by chance. Nothing more. But I kept returning to the feeling I'd had on the beach. That quiet, unplaceable warmth, the sense of almost recognizing something. I tried a few times to trace it back to something specific, a childhood object with a similar pattern, a place I had visited once that might have had something like it, a person who might have owned something similar. Nothing came. The feeling had no source I could identify. It simply existed, attached to the small piece of wood without explanation or origin. On the fourth day, I brought it to the beach with me, I'm not entirely sure why. Perhaps I thought returning it to where I found it might clarify something. Perhaps I simply wanted to hold it again near the water in the same light where I had first seen it. I held it at the edge of the tide for a long moment. The ocean moved quietly around my shoes. The evening light was soft and low. And I found, standing there, that I still couldn't put it back. So I carried it home again. And after that, I stopped questioning it. The walks continued as they always had. Same path through the dune grass. Same hollow sound underfoot. Same moment of opening when the beach appeared and the ocean arrived all at once. But something has shifted quietly in the way I moved along the tide line. Before I had walked without particular intention, eyes moving loosely, noticing things without searching for them. Now I found myself paying closer attention, not looking for anything specific, just more present somehow, more patient, as though the beach had asked me a question I hadn't fully heard yet, and I was waiting for it to repeat itself. For the first 2 weeks of June, I found ordinary things. A long piece of driftwood, silver gray, so smooth it felt like fabric. Several fragments of sea glass in shades of white and pale brown. A plastic buoy, fade orange, that had clearly traveled a long distance. The usual collection of shells in various stages of becoming sand. Nothing unusual. Nothing that made me pause the way the first piece had. I began to wonder if that evening had simply been a good evening. A lucky find. The kind of that things happens once on a beach and doesn't repeat. That was what I told myself, and for a while I almost believed it. The second object arrived on Thursday near the end of June. I found it farther down the beach than usual, closer to the rocks, where the tide left deeper deposits of kelp and debris. At first, I thought it was a shelf. It had the quality of something natural, small, irregular in shape, pale at the edges. But when I picked it up, the weight was wrong for a shell. Too dense, too uniform. I turned it over in my hand. It was a small disc of metal, roughly circular, no larger than a coat button. Brass, perhaps, or something close to it, though the color had shifted over time toward a deeper green tone. One side was completely smooth. The other had markings on it, fine lines arranged in a pattern that took me a moment to recognize. A compass rose, 8 points, each one carefully etched. The cardinal direction mark in script too small to read clearly in the fading light. I held it closer. North, south, east, west. And between them, the diagonal points, each rendered with the same careful attention. The metal work was old. That much was clear from the weight and the color and the particular way lines had softened at their edges, as though many hands had held the thing before mine. I examined it for a long time, standing at the edge of the kelp line while the tide moved in around him. A compass rose was not unusual, as objects went. Old ships had carried them. Old instruments had been decorated with them. The ocean along this coast had swallowed more than a few vessels over the centuries, and what the sea takes, it sometimes returns. There was nothing particularly mysterious about finding a piece of old brass on an Oregon beach. And yet, the compass rose had 8 points. The moon on the piece of wood at home had 5 stars arranged around it. I counted them again in my memory to be certain. 5. I stood there longer than I should have, the brass disc warming slowly in my hand, the ocean moving quietly around my shoes. Then I put it in my pocket, and I walked home with 2 things I couldn't explain sitting side by side on the windowsill. Just arrived slowly the way the summers arrives on the Oregon coast. Nothing with heat, exactly, but with particular quality of light. Longer evenings, a warmth that gathered in the dunes by afternoon and lingered until well after sunset. The view changed with the season. More visitors during the day, families with folding chairs and children who ran directly into the water without hesitation. Kite flyers gathering near the dunes in the late afternoon wind. Couples walking slowly at the edge of the tide as the light faded. By the time I arrived each evening, most of them had gone. The beach returned to itself. Quieter, wider somehow, in the way that empty spaces always feel larger than crowded ones. I had settled into a rhythm by them. Walk south, move slowly along the tide line. Notice what the ocean had left since yesterday. Most evenings, nothing unusual. A sand dollar, almost complete, pale and fragile in my hand. A length of fishing line, tangled around a small weight. A bottle, green glass, empty, its label blank dissolved. The brass disc had joined the wooden piece of my windowsill. I had arranged them slightly apart, with a space between them. The way you leave a space for something you expect to continue. I wasn't sure why I did that. It felt right. The third object arrived in the second week of July. I almost missed it entirely. I had stopped to watch a brown pelican moving low over the water, its wing barely clearing the surface of each wave, and when I looked back down at the tide line, I nearly stepped on it. It was half buried in wet sand, dark with water, and it had the particular stillness of something that has been resting before a long time. I crouched down and worked it free carefully. Sand fell away from it in slow, wet clumps. It was a small cylinder of wood, no longer than my finger, narrower at the one end than the other. Its surface was covered in tiny raised pins, arranged in a spiral pattern that wound from one end to the other. I turned it slowly under the fading light. The pins caught the last of the sun and threw small points of gold across my palm. I had seen something like this before, though it took me a moment to remember where. A music box mechanism. The cylinder that turns inside, the part catches the teeth of the gum and procedures the notes. I turn it again, more slowly this time. The spiral of the pins was intact, not broken, not corroded beyond recognition. Worn, certainly, and darkened by the water in time. But whole, I stayed crouched at the tide line for a long moment, the cylinder resting across my fingers. The pelican had moved far down the beach by then, a small dark shape against the copper water. The wind moved through the tall grass behind me. The ocean continued its slow work at the edge of the sand, and I held in my hands the inner reckoning of a music box. the same kind of object that might fit inside a small wooden case with a carved moon and 5 stars on its lid. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't even fully let myself think it clearly. But the thought was there, at the edge of everything, patient and unhurried, the way the tide is patient. I put the cylinder in my pocket, walked home, set it between the wooden piece and the brass disc on the windowsill, and stood looking at the three of them for a while as the last of the light left the room. There is a particular kind of attention that develops slowly. Not the sharp, focused kind, not the kind you decide to have. More like the way your eyes adjust to a dim room without asking them to. You simply begin to see more than you did before. That was what happened to me that July. I hadn't made any decision to look differently. I hadn't told myself the objects meant something. I had only placed 3 things on a windowsill with a space between them, and continued walking the same half-mile of beach every evening as the summer light stretched longer and longer toward the water. But something in the way I moved had changed. Quieter somehow, more patient with the spaces between things. I began keeping a small notebook. Nothing elaborate. A narrow spiral bound one I had bought original from grocery list and never used. Each evening after my walk, I wrote down what I had found. Not just the unusual things, everything. The color of the sea glass, the length of the driftwood, the exact position of the beach where something appeared, the height of the tide, the direction of the wind. I told myself it was simply a way of paying attention, of making the walks feel more intentional. But looking back, I think some part of me had already begun to suspect that the attention was exactly what the beach required. That whatever it was living for me, it would only continue if it was truly watching. The fourth object arrived on a warm evening in late July. I found it close to where I had found the wooden piece in June. Same stretch of beach, same position relief to the tide line. Almost exactly the same distance from the cluster of dark rocks and the south end. It was a small piece of fabric, deep blue, almost navy, with a texture that suggested it had once been something thinner than it appeared now. Salt and water has stiffened it slightly at the edges, but at its center it remains surprisingly soft. I unfolded it carefully. It was roughly square, about the size of a handkerchief. In one corner, embroidered in a thread that once been silver and had darkened to grey, was a small design. I held it close to see it clearly in the failing light. A wave, a single wave, rendered in a style so simple it was almost abstract. 3 curved lines rising and falling, clean and deliberate, the kind of image someone takes time over. I folded again along its original creases and held it for a moment. The fabric was thin enough that I could feel the warmth of my own hand through it almost immediately. I thought about the wave embroidered in the corner, a wave found on a beach. That alone meant nothing. It was perhaps the most logical image to find near the ocean. And yet, I stood there longer than necessary, the folded cloth resting in my palm, the tide moving quietly behind me. I wrote it down in the notebook when I got home. 4th object, same location as the first. I underlined the last part without deciding to. August arrived with a shift in the light. Subtle at first, the evening didn't shorten noticeably, but the quality of the sound changed. A degree or two lower on the horizon, the shadows on the beach growing slightly longer by 5 o'clock. Summer beginning very quietly to consider its own ending. I had been walking the beach for 3 months by then. The notebook had filled a third of its pages. The windowsill held 4 objects now, arranged in the order I had found them. The wooden lid with the moon and stars, the brass disc with the compass rose, the cylinder with its spiral of pins, the square of blue fabric with the wave. I looked at them each morning before leaving for work, and each evening when I returned, not obsessively, just the way you glance at something that has quietly become part of the room, part of the particular arrangement of your daily life. But that month I began noticing other things, small things, things that were easy to explain individually, but that accumulate over days and weeks into something harder to dismiss. The first thing I noticed was the location. 3 of the 4 objects had appeared with a 20-foot stretch of beach. The same narrow band of tide line, slightly south of the midpoint of my walk, where the sand curved very gentle inward before straining again towards the rocks. I had made the spot in my notebook with small crosses. Looking at the page, the pattern was difficult to ignore. I told myself that tidal pattern explained it. The objects traveling in the same ocean currents would naturally deposit in similar locations along a given stretch of coast. I had read enough about beach dynamics by then to know that was true. Certain beaches had specific zones where debris accumulated consistently. It was physics, not mystery. I told myself that, and mostly I believe it. The second thing I noticed was the timing. 4 objects in approximately 10 weeks of walking. That alone was not unusual. What was unusual was the interval. I went back through the notebook and counted carefully. Between the first and the second object, 17 days. Between the second and the third, 19 days. Between the third and fourth, 18 days. Roughly, though not exactly, the same gap each time. I sat with that for a while. Currents didn't work that way. Currents were not calendars. There was no mechanism in the ocean that could deposit objects at regular human intervals. I wrote the numbers down on a separate page and looked at them for a long time. Then I wrote beneath them, coincidence, and close to the notebook, but I left it open on the table rather than returning it to the drawer. The third thing I noticed was harder to name. It had to do with condition. Every object I had found was worn in the way that the ocean travel things are worn. Smoothed, softened, darkened by salt and time. None of that was unusual. What was unusual was each object was also in some way intact. The wooden lid had its curving still legible. The brass disc had its compass rose still readable. The cylinder had its pins still in place, still arranged in their spiral. The fabric had its embroidered web still visible, still soft at its center. Objects that spent significant time in salt water don't usually arrive in that condition. They arrive broken, corroded, illegible. I had found enough debris over 3 months to know the difference between something the ocean had processed fully and something it had handled more carefully. These 4 objects felt like the latter, as though they had been carried rather than tumbled, delivered rather than lost. I didn't write that in the notebook. It felt like too large a thing to put into words on a grocery list page. Instead, I went to the windowsill and stood looking at the 4 objects in the last of the evening light. The carved moon on the wooden lid, the compass rose on the brass disc, the spiral of pins on the cylinder, the way of the blue fabric. 4 images, 4 directions, perhaps, though I hadn't thought of it quite that way before. Moon, compass, music, water. I stood there until the room grew dark, and then I went to bed without turning on the lights, because some thoughts I had learned were better left in the almost dark, where they could exist without needing to become anything more certain than they already were. The fifth object arrived on a Tuesday, 18 years after the fourth. I had counted, not obsessively. I had simply been aware of the number, the way you become aware of a recurring sound in a quiet house. Not alarming, just present, just there. I found it in the usual place. The same gentle curve in the tie line, slightly south of center, where the sand bent almost imperceptibly inward before straightening again towards the rocks. It was small enough that I nearly passed it. A narrow strip of metal, slightly carved, with a row of fine tines extending from edge like the tip of a comb, which was exactly what it was. I recognized it immediately, though it took my hands a moment to accept what my eyes already understood. A comb, the kind that lives inside a music box. The part that catches the pins on the cylinder as it turns. The part that produces the notes. I held it carefully, the tinies facing up, and moved to where the light was better. The metal had darkened with age and salt, but the tinies were intact. All of them. I counted slowly. 15 times. Each one at different length, each untuned, in theory, to a different pitch. I thought about the cylinder on my windowsill at home, the spiral of pins arranged in their careful pattern. I thought about the relationship between those pins and these tinies. How one cuffed the other, how the catching produces sound, how the sound accumulated across a full rotation of the cylinder become a melody. I stood at the tie line for a long time, the metal comb resting across my fingers, the ocean moving quietly behind me. And for the first time since June, I let myself think clearly about what I was holding. Not a collection of separate objects, not a series of interesting fish finds with a few unusual coincidences attached. 5 pieces found over the course of an entire summer, in the same location, at regular intervals, each one intact in a way that suggested care rather than change. Each one part of the same object, an object I still don't have in its entirety. I wrote in the notebook that evening for longer than usual. Not analysis, not list, just the sensation of standing at the water edge holding something that felt like it had been placed rather than lost. And the quiet, persistent question underneath everything. What arrived in 18 more days? I didn't change my routine. That felt important somehow. Whatever was happening on that beach, it had happened because I was simply present, walking slowly, paying attention, not searching, not demanding. So I continued, saying fat through the dune grass, saying hollow sound underfoot, saying moment of opening when the beach appeared and the ocean arrived all at once. I found ordinary things in those 18 days. A piece of pale green sea glass, almost translucent. A sand dollar with a single crack running through its center. A lamp of gold so long I had to step over it twice. I noted everything in the notebook and returned most of it to the water. The 5 pieces on my windowsill remained in their arrangement. Ordered, patient, with a space at the end that I have left without deciding to. On the morning of the 18th day, the fog came in early. By noon, it had settled along the coast in a low, dense layer that softened everything. The dune grass, the dark sand, the line with the water met the shore. I waited until my usual hour, 5 o'clock. The fog had thinned slightly by then, turning the late afternoon light into something diffuse and pale. The beach had the quality of a room with the curtains drawn, quiet, contained. I walked more slowly than usual, not because I was nervous, because something in the air suggested that slowness was the appropriate response. The tide was low, lower than I had seen it in weeks. The wet sand stretched far out toward the water, dark and smooth, reflecting the pale sky above it like a second horizon. I reached the curve in the tide line, the familiar bend in the beach where the sun turned gently inward. And I stopped. It was there, half buried in wet sand, the way the first piece had been. Darker than I expected, larger. When I crouched and worked it free from the sand, I understood immediately what I was holding. A box. Small enough to fit in both hands with the fingers touching. Rectangular, with a slight depth that suggested it had been made to contain something precisely. The wood was the same as the lid, dark, almost mahogany in color, though the water had deepened the tone. the same carved border along each edge, careful and fine, the kind of work that takes patience. One on the bottom, barely visible, the marker's mark, a small moon, 5 stars, identical to the ones on the lid. I turned the box over slowly. The inside was lined with what had once been a deep blue fabric, now so stiffened at the edges but still soft at the center. The same blue as the handkerchief with the wave. I stood there for a long moment in the fog. The ocean moved quietly behind me. The beach was empty in both directions, and I held in my hands the body of a music box that had spent an entire summer delivering itself to me, piece by piece, across 18 days and a half mile of Oregon coast. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I simply held it, and then I carried home. That evening, I arranged all 6 pieces on the kitchen table. The lid with the moon and stars, the brass disc with the compass rose, the cylinder with its spiral of pins, the square of blue fabric, the metal comb with its 15 tines, and the body of the box waiting at the center. I sat in the front of them for a while without touching them, anything. The apartment was quiet. Outside, the fog had thickened again, muffling the sound of the street below. The kitchen lamp cast a warm circle of light across the table. I thought about June, the first evening, the tangle of kelp, the piece of dark wood I had almost missed, the warmth I had felt and couldn't explain. I thought about all the evenings between then and now, the notebook filled with careful observations, the windowsill with its growing arrangement. The question I had stopped asking because it had no answer, and had learned instead to simply carry with me along the tie line. I placed the cylinder inside first. It fit exactly the way a key fits a lock it was made for. No adjustment needed, no resistance. Simply settled into place as though it had always been there. I placed the comb next, sliding it into the narrow channel along one side. It cuffed, held, the tines aligned with the cylinder at the precise angle they needed to reach. I placed the blue fabric inside the lid, smoothing it gentle with my thumb. Then I set the brass disc into the small inset on the outside of the body, where it fit as cleanly as the rest. I held the lid above the box. My hands were very steady. I wasn't nervous exactly. It was more like the feeling at the end of a long walk, when you can finally see where you were going all along. A quiet recognition, an arrival, a lower the lid. It closed with the softest sound, a small, precise click, and then I turned the key. The melody was simple. It moved slowly, the cylinder turning at the unhurried pace that all mechanics favor. Each note arrived cleanly, a brief silence after it, before the next one followed. I recognized it immediately, not consciously, not in the way you recognize a song you can name, more the way you recognize light through a window in a house you lived in once, long ago, when you were very small. Not the memory itself, the feeling that memory leaves behind. That warmth behind the chest, that sense of something almost named. The melody played through once, then again. The cylinder turning steadily in the quiet kitchen while the fog pressed softly against the windows, and the lamp held its warm circle of light across the table. I didn't move. I didn't try to identify the song. I had learned over the course of this summer that some things were better left without names, that the not knowing was not a failure. It was simply another kind of knowing, a quieter one. The music box played on, note by note, patient and unhurried. The way the ocean is patient, the way the beach had been patient with me all summer, leaving things in careful intervals, waiting for me to be ready to find them. I sat at the kitchen table in the fog-softened dark and listened. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt no need to understand anything at all. I still walk the beach every evening. The summer has ended now, or nearly. The light arrived lower each day. The dawn grass had started to turn. The visitors have gone home, and the beach has returned to its quieter self. I walk the same smile, south toward the rocks, eyes moving along the tide line, noticing what the ocean left behind. Most evenings, ordinary things, sea glass, driftwood, shells in various stages of becoming sand. I examine each thing briefly and return more of them to the water. But I walk a little more slowly now than I used to, and I pay a different kind of attention, not searching, not expecting, just present, open to whatever the water decides to carry in. The music box sits on my windowsill now, between the pale green sea glass and the smooth stone with the white line through its center. Some evenings, before I leave for my walk, I wind the key and let it play through once. The notes move through the quiet apartment, patient and hurried, and I stand at the window for a moment, listening before I go. I still don't know what the melody is called. I still don't know where the box came from, or how it arrived, piece by piece, across an entire Oregon summer, delivered by an ocean that has no reason to leave anything for anyone in particular. Some mornings I think about those questions. By the time I reach the beach, they have usually dissolved into the sound of the waves. The wave back dissolves when the light reaches it, gradually, without any particular moment you can point to and say, there, that was when it lifted. There are things I have learned that exist more fully when left unexplained. The melody is one of them. The summer is another. And so, each evening I walk, I look, I listen, and I let the ocean keep its secrets the way it has always kept them, quietly, without apologize, without end.